I want you to start by picturing a map of Europe, specifically in the year 1815.
Right. Right after the dust has settled.
Exactly. It is quiet. It is overwhelmingly rural. You have these kings sitting on thrones who genuinely believe God placed them there. And for the most part, the people out in the fields agree. Or, well, at least they don't have the power to
They
disagree.
certainly don't have the means to organize any kind of resistance.
No. I mean, the fastest way to move information or to move people is a horse.
Yeah.
That hasn't changed since the Roman Empire. If you were born a peasant in 1815, you were going to die a peasant. And you will likely do it within maybe 10 miles of the exact spot where you were born.
It really is a world frozen in amber. The Congress of Vienna has just wrapped up. Napoleon has been exiled to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. And the monarchs of Europe are essentially high-fiving each other because they think they've successfully turned back the clock. They think they've erased the French Revolution entirely.
But, and this is really the central tension of our entire deep dive today, while they are patting themselves on the back, the ground beneath their feet is already cracking.
Because across the English Channel, a steam engine is firing up.
Yes. And that engine isn't just going to change how we make cloth. It is going to completely dissolve that frozen agrarian world of 1815.
It's quite ironic when you think about it. The monarchs are terrified of ideas. They are worried about democracy, about liberty, about the guillotine. But the thing that is actually going to destroy their entire social order isn't the philosophy, at least not at first. It's a piston.
It's machinery. So today we're taking a massive deep dive into the long 19th century. This covers the AP European History Unit 6 material, which runs from 1815 right up to the cliff edge of 1914.
Industrialization and its effects.
Right. And we aren't just going to talk about better looms or faster trains, though we will get into that. This is a deep dive into how humanity completely rewrote the rules of human existence. We are going to look at how Europe went from that quiet agrarian map to the trenches of World War I.
Machine guns, chemical warfare, total industrial slaughter, all in the span of just 1 century.
It's wild.
It is the critical pivot point in modern history. Industrialization didn't just change the economy, it changed who we are. It created entirely new social classes, new political ideologies, new types of urban anxiety, and eventually it created the capacity for global self-destruction.
We have a massive amount of ground to cover today, so to keep it organized, we've broken this deep dive into 4 distinct slices. First, we are going to look at the economic engine, that's the technology itself, and the money behind it.
The nuts and bolts.
Literally. Then we'll move to the human cost, the grime, the misery, and the total restructuring of family life. After that, we shift to the political backlash, how the old conservative guard tried to fight this new reality. And finally, the rise of the interventionist state, how governments woke up and realized they had to manage this chaos or they would be overthrown by it.
And if we map all this out correctly, by the end of this deep dive, you'll see that World War I was not some random accident. It was the absolute logical conclusion of everything we're about to discuss.
Let's get right into slice 1, the engine of change. We have to start with the classic historical question. Why Britain?
Right.
Why did this massive explosion of industry happen on a rainy, relatively small island in the North Atlantic and not in, say, China or France or the Ottoman Empire?
It is the ultimate perfect storm scenario. You can't point to just one single factor. It's this incredible convergence of geography, geology, and politics. Let's start with the geology. Britain basically won the lottery.
You're talking about coal.
Coal and iron. But specifically, it's about where that coal and iron was located. Britain is an island, and a narrow one at that. Their coal deposits were massive, they were relatively close to the surface, and crucially, they were near the water.
Why is the water so important early on?
Because coal is incredibly heavy. In the year 1800, if you have to move a ton of coal 20 miles overland using a horse and a cart, you've just lost your entire profit margin. It's simply too expensive to transport. But Britain had this weirdly convenient network of navigable rivers. Plus, they started digging canals everywhere.
So they could float the heavy fuel cheaply long before anyone even dreamed of a railroad.
Exactly. But having fuel in the ground is only half the battle. You can have all the coal in the universe, but if you don't have the money to build a factory, that coal just stays in the dirt.
Which brings us to the money, the capital.
This is where the preceding commercial revolution really pays dividends. Britain had a highly sophisticated central bank, the Bank of England, and they had this very wealthy class of entrepreneurs who had been trading globally for over a century. They had wealth, from the slave trade, from tea, from spices,
They had liquid capital.
lots of it. And more importantly, they had a culture that was willing to risk that capital.
They were the venture capitalists of the 18th century.
They really were. But the critical piece, the piece that separates Britain from France or Russia, is the political structure. Britain had a parliamentary government that deeply respected private property.
Meaning the king couldn't just wake up one morning, decide he was short on cash, and say, "Nice textile mill you've got there, I think I'll take it."
Precisely. In an absolute monarchy on the continent, accumulating massive, visible wealth could actually be quite dangerous. It made you a target for the crown. But in Britain, the House of Commons was filled with people who were highly sympathetic to business interests. They passed laws protecting patents. They offered financial incentives.
Like the Royal Society of Arts handing out actual cash prizes for new inventions.
Right. It created a completely safe harbor for innovation.
Let's talk about some of those specific innovations, because you hear the same names over and over. James Watt, 1769, the steam engine. But steam pumps already existed before Watt, didn't they?
They did. Thomas Newcomen invented a steam pump way back in 1712. But the Newcomen engine was absolute garbage in terms of efficiency. It was this massive, lumbering beast that was used for one thing, pumping water out of flooded coal mines.
And it burned a ridiculous amount of coal to do it.
So much coal that you could literally only afford to run it if you were sitting right on top of a coal mine. But James Watt, along with his business partner Matthew Boulton, who provided the capital watt refined that engine, he added a separate condenser.
Which means the main cylinder doesn't have to keep cooling down and heating back up over and over.
Exactly. It made the engine vastly more efficient, and suddenly it was efficient enough that you could use it to turn a wheel, rotary motion.
And that tiny mechanical shift just changes the map of the world.
Completely. Before Watt's rotary engine, if you wanted to build a factory, you had to build it right next to a fast-flowing river, so you could use a water wheel.
Okay.
That means you were building out in the rural countryside. You were far away from your labor pool, and you were far away from your markets.
But after Watt?
After Watt, you can put a steam engine anywhere you want. You can drop a massive factory right in the middle of a city. You bring the factory to the people instead of the other way around.
And the other major bottleneck that gets solved is in textiles. We have to mention James Hargreaves and the spinning jenny in 1764.
Right. Before the jenny, spinning raw cotton into thread was incredibly tedious. One person spinning one spool of thread. The weavers were constantly waiting around for more thread. The spinning jenny allowed one single worker to spin multiple spools simultaneously. 8 at first, then eventually over 100.
Suddenly you have an absolute mountain of thread.
Which then leads to the power loom to weave all that thread into cloth at breakneck speed.
And the net result of all this machinery is cheap clothing.
It is the world's first true consumer revolution. Think about something as basic as underwear. Before the Industrial Revolution, ordinary working people didn't really have changes of clothes. Textiles were too expensive. You wore your clothes until they essentially rotted off your body.
Which is grim.
Very grim. But suddenly, cotton cloth is dirt cheap. People can afford to wash their clothes. Hygiene improves. Basic physical comfort improves. It is the dawn of the mass market.
I want to fast forward just a bit to the year 1851 because we need a visual for just how dominant Britain became. The Crystal Palace.
The Great Exhibition of 1851. This is arguably one of the most symbolic moments of the entire 19th century. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, organizes this massive international fair in London.
And the building they constructed to house it was the real statement.
It was a cathedral dedicated to industry. It was built entirely of cast iron and plate glass. It was 3 city blocks long. It was so impossible large that they actually built it around fully grown elm trees right there in Hyde Park.
That is just such an unbelievable flex. It's Britain saying, we are so advanced we can literally put nature inside a glass cage.
That is the exact psychological message.
Yeah.
It was Britain loudly announcing that they had conquered nature. Inside the palace, they displayed massive locomotives, hydraulic presses, giant power looms. Over 6 million people traveled to see it. It was Britain inviting the rest of the world to come to London and see exactly how far behind they were.
But there is a fierce political battle happening inside Britain at this same time that we really need to unpack: the Corn Laws.
Yes.
Now, I know the phrase Corn Laws sounds like the most boring, dry topic imaginable, but when you actually read the primary sources from this period, this was a heavyweight title fight for the very soul of the British economy.
It absolutely was. To understand the stakes, you have to look at the players involved.
Right.
In one corner, you have the landed gentry, the old aristocracy. These are the families who have run Britain essentially since William the Conqueror. Their wealth comes from owning vast estates and selling the grain grown on them.
And they love the Corn Laws because the Corn Laws are essentially high tariffs that keep foreign grain out of Britain. No cheap Russian or French wheat allowed, which keeps the price of domestic British wheat artificially high.
Right, it protects their aristocratic profit margins.
Yeah.
But in the other corner, you have this aggressive rising class, the industrial bourgeoisie, the factory owners, the new money.
And why do the factory owners care about the price of wheat? They don't farm.
They care deeply because of wages.
Hmm.
If the price of a loaf of bread is artificially high, a factory owner has to pay his workers a higher baseline wage just to keep them from starving to death. If bread is cheap, he can slash wages and increase his own profit margins. It is cold, ruthless, capitalist calculus.
So the factory owners aren't out there protesting because their hearts bleed for the hungry poor. They're fighting to lower their own overhead costs.
Exactly. They formed the Anti-Corn Law League. They mobilized massive public rallies. They used the new cheap printing presses to flood the country with pamphlets. And finally, in 1846, they won. Parliament repealed the Corn Laws.
This really feels like the exact moment where the old money officially lost control of the country to the new money.
It is the definitive moment. Britain looked in the mirror and decided, we are no longer an agricultural nation. We are the workshop of the world. By allowing cheap foreign grain to flood in, they essentially sacrificed their own farming sector. But they fueled the industrial cities. Farmhands couldn't make a living anymore, so they lost their jobs and migrated straight to Manchester to work in the textile mills.
So Britain is just sprinting into the future. What is happening with everyone else? How does France fit into this picture?
France is the tortoise to Britain's hare. They simply didn't have the massive, easily accessible coal deposits that Britain had. Plus, you have to remember, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars completely disrupted their economy for 25 years. So French industrialization was a much slower, much more gradual process.
And it was much more heavily state-controlled, wasn't it?
Yes. In Britain, you had wildcat capitalism driven by private individuals. In France, the government looked across the channel, panicked, and said, we have to catch up. So the French state funded the railways. The state built the Quentin Canal to connect their resources. It was what historians call a dual revolution. They grew their industry, but a massive portion of the population stayed on the farms.
Which means they avoided some of the horrors of urbanization.
Right, France never really developed the sprawling, apocalyptic urban slums that Britain did, but as a result, they also never matched Britain's raw industrial output.
And then we have the regions that really fell behind, the laggards,
Yeah.
Southern and Eastern Europe.
The general rule of thumb is, the further east and the further south you travel in Europe, the harder industrialization gets. Italy and Spain simply lack the raw geological resources. If you don't have coal, you can't run steam engines. It's just physics. But Russia is a tragedy of social structure.
You're talking about serfdom.
You cannot have an industrial revolution when 90% of your population is legally bound to the dirt. A Russian serf cannot pack up his bags and move to St. Petersburg to work in a steel mill. He is essentially property. So Russia remained this giant slumbering feudal empire, while Britain was literally building underground subway systems.
And the cost of missing the industrial boat could be apocalyptic. We have to look at the Irish potato famine as the darkest example of this lag.
It is the absolute worst-case scenario. Ireland was technically part of the British Empire, but Britain managed it basically as an agricultural colony. It had zero industrial base. The rural population was almost entirely dependent on a single primitive food source to survive: the potato.
And when the blight hit the potato crops in
There
1845,
was no backup system. There was no complex industrial economy to absorb the shock or distribute alternative resources. You had mass starvation. Millions died and millions more emigrated. It was a brutal demonstration to the rest of the world that in the modern age, if you remain a primitive agrarian society, you are vulnerable to total extinction events.
let's shift our timeline forward slightly. We need to talk about the late 19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution.
Right. If the first revolution, the British one, was all about textiles, steam, and iron, the second industrial revolution, which kicks off around 1870, is driven by entirely new elements: steel, chemicals, electricity, and petroleum.
Steel seems to be the linchpin here. I mean, iron is great, but it's brittle.
Right. Iron shatters under too much stress. Steel is flexible and incredibly strong. But before the 1850s, steel was ridiculously expensive to produce. You only used it for small things, like swords or watch springs. But then Henry Bessemer invents the Bessemer process. He figured out how to blast air through molten iron to burn off the impurities.
And suddenly, steel isn't a luxury item anymore. It's cheap to mass produce.
And cheap steel changes the skyline of the world. You get skyscrapers, you get massive suspension bridges, you get gigantic ocean liners, and somewhat ominously, you get much, much deadlier artillery cannons.
Then you throw electricity into the mix, which completely alters the rhythm of human life.
It literally conquers the night. Before electricity, you were tied to the sun, or you relied on dangerous gas lamps. Now, factories can run 3 8-hour shifts. They can operate 24 hours a day under electric light. Electric streetcars allow cities to sprawl out because the working class can actually commute from further away.
But the second revolution also changed the nature of business itself, didn't it? The first revolution was driven by guys like Watt and Hargreaves, tinkerers working in workshops. The second revolution requires something much bigger.
You cannot build a modern steel mill in your backyard shed. You need massive science laboratories, you need armies of engineers, and most of all, you need millions of dollars in capital. This naturally leads to the rise of corporate capitalism.
It's the age of monopolies.
Yes, cartels, trusts, massive industrial firms that wielded more economic power than some actual government.
And this is exactly where Germany steps onto the world stage.
Germany is the undisputed star of the Second Industrial Revolution.
Which is actually wild to think about, because if you look at a map in 1800, Germany doesn't even exist. It's just the Holy Roman Empire, which is a chaotic mess of hundreds of little independent states and principalities.
Right, but the Germans used economics to forge a nation. Even before they unified politically under Bismarck in 1871, they unified economically. They created the Zollverein in 1834.
The customs union.
Exactly. The German states agreed to abolish all tariffs between themselves. So if you were moving coal from Prussia to Bavaria, there's no tax. It created a massive internal free trade zone. But, and this is the crucial part, they threw up a massive tariff wall against the outside world.
This is the brainchild of the economist Friedrich List, right?
Yes. List wrote about the national system. He argued that free trade was great for Britain because Britain was already on top. But he said if the disunited German states tried to trade freely with Britain, cheap British manufactured goods would flood in and crush German factories before they even got off the ground.
So he said they needed to protect their infant industries.
Build a wall, let German industry grow strong internally without British competition, and then take on the world.
And it worked terrifyingly well.
By 1900, Germany is outproducing Britain in steel. They absolutely dominate the global chemical industry. Synthetic dyes, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and massive German firms like Krupp aren't just making railroad tracks. They're working hand in glove with the Prussian government to forge weapons. Germany didn't industrialize just to make a profit. They industrialized to build a war machine.
Which is the perfect, chilling transition to the people who are actually working inside that machine. Let's move to slice 2, the human cost.
This is where the narrative gets very gritty, because we are looking at a total fundamental restructuring of human society. For 1,000 years prior to this, European society was defined by blood. You were born an aristocrat or you were born a commoner. That was it.
But now your identity is defined by money, specifically your relationship to what Karl Marx called the means of production.
And two great classes of the 19th century, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat.
Let's start with the bourgeoisie, the middle class. They aren't the old nobility, but they have capital. What defines their culture?
I would say they are defined by a mix of intense ambition and deep status anxiety. They are self-made men. They believe in meritocracy and hard work. But they are absolutely desperate to physically and socially distance themselves from the grimy working class below them. And the primary way they did this was through the cult of domesticity.
I always find this concept so fascinating and honestly a bit infuriating, the idea of the angel in the house.
It is a profound paradox. The bourgeois man goes out into the industrial city, which is cutthroat, dirty, polluted, and fiercely Darwinian. So the middle class decided that the home had to be the exact opposite. The home was a sacred sanctuary, a place of moral purity and peace.
And the guardian of that sanctuary is the wife.
Exactly. In this culture, if a man was truly successful, his wife absolutely did not work outside the home. She stayed in the suburban house, managed the domestic servants, and raised the children with strict moral instruction. Her idleness, her distance from the dirty world of commerce was his ultimate status symbol. It proves to society that he had made it.
But for the working class, the proletariat, that whole concept was a cruel joke.
Completely unattainable. In the working class slums, everyone worked. This is the family economy. You couldn't survive on one factory wage.
Let's talk about the child labor aspect because we have all seen those horrific photographs of 10-year-olds covered in coal dust. But the sources point out that children working wasn't actually a new phenomenon.
That's a really important distinction. Children had always worked on agricultural farms. If you were a 6-year-old on a farm in 1700, you weren't going to school. You were feeding chickens, you were picking rocks out of the dirt. You were contributing to the family's survival.
So what made the industrial version so much worse?
The environment and the authority structure. On a farm, you worked alongside your parents. The work was paced by the sun and the seasons. You could rest in the shade. In a textile mill, you were separated from your family. You were working for 14 hours straight, pacing yourself to a high-speed, deafening, dangerous steam-powered machine that never gets tired.
And if you fall asleep,
You lose a finger in the gears, or you get beaten by an overseer. In the coal mines, they had children called trappers, whose only job was to sit in the pitch black for 12 hours and open ventilation doors for the coal carts. It completely alienated children from their parents and turned them into cheap, expendable cogs.
and we have to talk about where these people were sleeping when they weren't working. Let's look at Manchester.
Manchester is the quintessential shock city of the industrial age. Its population exploded so violently that there was zero urban planning. Real estate speculators just threw up these incredibly cheap housing blocks called tenements.
Back-to-back housing.
Right. 3 or 4 stories high, no windows in the back, totally unventilated.
And the sanitation. I was reading the primary source reports from public health inspectors, and it is stomach-turning.
It's a biohazard. There was no running water and no sewer system. You might have one single outdoor privy hole, an outhouse shared by 200 people. The night soil, which is a polite Victorian term for human feces, literally piled up in the courtyards and seeped into the groundwater. People threw their garbage directly out the window into the mud.
It is the perfect breeding ground for disease.
Cholera, tuberculosis, typhus, they swept through these slums like wildfire. In the worst districts of Manchester in the 1840s, the average life expectancy for a working-class laborer was under 20 years. You were breathing thick, black coal smoke every single day. You were drinking water tainted with human waste. It was absolute misery.
And yet, despite the horrific conditions, people kept migrating to the cities.
Because the alternative, starving to death as a landless peasant in the countryside, was somehow even worse. And to be fair to the historical record, over the long arc of the 19th century, things did gradually begin to improve. We see this in the standard of living debate. By the 1870s and 1880s, real wages for the working class were finally rising.
Which leads to the invention of leisure.
Yes, the weekend. The concept of actual free time that wasn't just spent collapsing from exhaustion. You get the rise of organized sports.
Yeah.
Rugby and soccer leagues form, often sponsored by the factories themselves to keep the men out of the pubs.
And you get a new kind of consumerism.
The department store. Places like the Bon Marché in Paris or Selfridges in London. Shopping stops being a chore where you just buy flour and salt and it becomes an experience, an activity. But we always have to remember that late-century improvement was paid for by the broken bodies of the 2 generations that preceded them.
So we have this booming, chaotic economy and a completely fractured, anxious society. Now we need to look at how the political elites tried to keep a lid on this boiling pot. Let's move to slice 3, the conservative order and the revolutionary backlash.
This is where the political thriller aspect of the century really kicks in. Let's go back to 1815, the Congress of Vienna. The architect of this entire era is Clemens von Metternich, the foreign minister of the Austrian Empire.
I always think of Metternich as the ultimate bouncer of Europe.
That is a brilliant way to look at him. His entire job is to keep the party orderly, keep the doors locked, and throw out anyone who even whispers the word revolution. His grand design was the Concert of Europe.
Which was basically an alliance system, right?
Yes, it was an agreement among the great powers, Britain, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and eventually a restored France. They agreed to work together to maintain the balance of power and actively suppress the twin plagues of the age, liberalism and nationalism.
We really need to define those terms, because liberal and conservative mean something very different in 1815 than they do in modern politics. Let's start with conservatism. What did Metternich believe?
19th century conservatism, drawn from thinkers like Edmund Burke, believed that human nature is fundamentally flawed and dangerous. Therefore, society needs rigid, traditional authority to prevent chaos. They believed in the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the established church. They believed stability is infinitely more important than individual liberty.
Okay, so then what is 19th century liberalism?
Think of John Stuart Mill. Classical liberalism was the ideology of the rising bourgeoisie. They wanted written constitutions. They wanted representative parliaments, though they usually only wanted men with property to be able to vote. They wanted freedom of the press, freedom of speech, and, crucially, free trade. Laissez-faire capitalism.
And the third ideology, the one that really kept Metternich awake at night, nationalism.
Nationalism is the explosive idea that a group of people who share a common language, a shared history, and a shared culture should have their own independent nation-state.
Which sounds perfectly reasonable today, but why was it a nightmare for Metternich?
Because look at the Austrian Empire. It wasn't a nation, it was a dynastic empire. The Habsburg Emperor ruled over ethnic Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Italians, and Romanians. If the idea of nationalism takes root, if the Hungarians decide they need their own country, the Austrian Empire ceases to exist. It shatters into a dozen pieces.
So Metternich tries to plug all the holes in the dam.
He uses sheer repression. In 1819, he pushes through the Carlsbad Decrees in the German states. This outlawed nationalist student fraternities heavily censored the press and put state spies directly into university classrooms to monitor professors. And whenever a revolt did pop up, like in Spain or Italy in the 1820s, the concert of Europe literally sent foreign armies across borders to crush it.
But you can't hold back the tide forever. The dam starts to crack in 1830, but it completely explodes in 1848.
The revolutions of 1848, the springtime of nations.
Yeah.
It is an incredible year. It starts, as it almost always does, in France. The working class and the middle class join forces in Paris. They throw up barricades in the streets, and they force King Louis Philippe to abdicate. They declare a republic.
And the shockwave just instantly spreads across the continent.
It travels along the new telegraph wires and railway lines. Within weeks, there are massive uprisings in Berlin, in Vienna, in Budapest, in Milan. Metternich himself is forced to disguise himself and flee Vienna in a laundry cart.
The monarchs are terrified. They start promising constitutions. They abolish serfdom in Austria. It looks like a total victory for the people.
It looked that way in March of 1848. But by December of that same year, the revolutions had completely collapsed. The monarchs were back in control, backed by their militaries.
How does that happen? How do you fumble a lead that massive? You have the people in the streets. You have the momentum. Why did 1848 fail?
It failed because the revolutionaries ultimately hated and feared each other much more than they hated the kings. You have to imagine two very different groups standing on those street barricades. Group A is the middle-class liberals. They want a constitution, free speech, and the right to vote.
But they also own the factories, and they want to protect their private property.
Exactly. Group B is the urban working class, the radicals and the early socialists. They are starving. They don't just want the right to vote. They want economic justice. They want the government to guarantee the right to work and to establish state-funded workshops.
So Group A looks at Group B's demands and completely panics.
Yes. The middle-class bourgeoisie looked at the working-class socialists and thought, these people are going to take my factory. They're going to redistribute my wealth. So when push came to shove, the liberals abandoned the revolution. They sided with the old conservative monarchs because the monarchs promised to restore order.
They chose order over liberty.
They did. In trance, the middle-class government literally ordered the army to fire on the working-class protesters during the June days. Thousands were killed.
And what about in Germany? Why did the revolution fail there?
In Germany, the liberals formed the Frankfurt Assembly. They spent months agonizing over how to write a constitution for a unified Germany. By the time they finally finished it and offered the crown to the King of Prussia, the king had realized the revolutionaries had lost their momentum.
He rejects it. He famously says he will not accept a crown from the gutter.
Meaning he will not accept power that is handed to him by commoners. He believed his power came from God and the sword. So he sends his troops to disperse the assembly. The dream of a liberal, unified Germany is crushed.
So if they all failed, was 1848 just a complete waste of time?
Politically, in the short term, yes. The borders didn't change, but ideologically, it changed everything. The concert of Europe was fundamentally broken. The monarchs realized they couldn't trust each other, and the revolutionary ideas didn't die. They just went underground. Nationalism and socialism abandoned their romantic idealism and became hard, pragmatic, and militant.
We also have to mention the one major power that completely missed the 1848 chaos: Russia.
Right. Tsar Nicholas I had clamped down so hard with his secret police that there was no revolution in Russia. But their isolation caught up to them. In 1856, they lose the Crimean War to Britain and France.
And that loss is a massive wake-up call for the Russian elites.
It was a profound humiliation. It proved undeniably that a massive agrarian empire relying on illiterate serfs with muskets could not defeat a modern industrialized nation that had steamships and rifled artillery.
So the new Tsar, Alexander II, decides he has to modernize. He issues the Emancipation Manifesto in 1861, freeing the serfs.
Which sounds like this incredible, noble Abraham Lincoln-style moment. But in reality, it was a deeply flawed half measure. The Russian serfs were technically free, but they were forced to buy the land they had been working from the nobility, usually at vastly inflated prices. They were essentially chained to the land by insurmountable debt instead of by law.
But the state still pushes for industry. Enter Sergei Witt in the 1890s.
Witt is the Russian finance minister, and he orchestrates an incredibly aggressive top-down industrialization program. He courts foreign capital from France, he builds massive steel plants, he spearheads the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railroad.
But by doing this, he accidentally creates a massive political bomb.
Exactly. When you industrialize an absolute autocracy, you pull millions of desperate, angry peasants out of the isolated countryside and you concentrate them in dense urban centers like St. Petersburg. But you give them zero political representation.
It's a powder keg waiting for a spark.
And that spark comes in 1905, when Russia disastrously loses a war to Japan. The country erupts in the 1905 revolution. The Tsar is violently forced to grant a constitution and create a parliament called the Duma.
Even though he completely ignores it and strips it of power almost immediately.
Right, it was just a Band-Aid. But it irreversibly set the stage for the Bolsheviks in 1917.
This brings us to our final section today, Slice 4, Ideological Shifts and the Rise of the Interventionist State.
This is the era of adapt or die. By the late 19th century, the traditional governments of Europe realized that Metternich's strategy of just shooting revolutionaries wasn't sustainable. The problems generated by industrial capitalism were simply too enormous.
But before we look at what the governments did, we need to look at the new pressures bubbling up from below, the isms. We've talked about liberalism, now we have to address socialism.
And we really need to distinguish between the two distinct phases of socialism. Early in the century, you had what historians call the utopian socialists, men like Robert Owen or Charles Fourier.
They were very optimistic.
Very. They believed that if you just set up model factory communities, where workers had decent housing, schools for their kids, and fair hours, the wealthy industrialists would see that happy workers were actually more productive, and they would voluntarily adopt the system.
Spoiler alert, they did not.
No, they didn't. And that brings us to 1848, and Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels publishing the Communist Manifesto. Marx looks at the utopians and basically calls them naive dreamers. Marx introduces scientific socialism.
What makes his version scientific in his eyes?
Marx argued that history isn't driven by good ideas or morality. He argued it is driven by historical laws, almost like the laws of physics, specifically the concept of dialectical materialism. Yeah. He said all of human history is the history of class struggle. The feudal lords were overthrown by the capitalist bourgeoisie, and by that exact same inescapable logic, the bourgeoisie must eventually be overthrown by the working class proletariat.
Because the system of capitalism inherently creates its own gravediggers.
Exactly. Marx argued that by building factories, the capitalists were doing the workers a favor. They were gathering the workers together, teaching them discipline, and giving them shared grievances. Marx said a violent revolution wasn't just a nice political goal, it was an absolute historical inevitability.
Which obviously terrified the ruling classes of Europe.
Beyond belief. And if Marx wasn't scary enough, you also had the anarchists, led by figures like Mikhail Bakunin.
And how do they differ from the Marxists?
Bakunin argued that Marx was wrong to want to seize control of the state to implement communism. Bakunin said the state itself is the ultimate source of oppression, any state. Therefore, the state must be violently destroyed. These were the radicals utilizing the new technology of dynamite. They threw bombs into cafes, they assassinated a Russian czar, a French president, an American president. It was an era of profound elite anxiety.
So the state looks at all this, they see Marxist trade unions organizing, they see anarchists throwing bombs, they see cholera wiping out the labor force, and they finally realize that the age of pure, hands-off, laissez-faire capitalism has to end.
Entered the interventionist state. Governments decide they have to take an active role in managing society. And to be clear, they didn't do this because they suddenly became bleeding-heart humanitarians. They did it as a survival mechanism to prevent revolution.
The most dramatic, visible example of this is the physical reconstruction of Paris under Baron Haussmann.
This is a phenomenal example. In the 1850s, Emperor Napoleon III hires Haussmann to essentially delete the medieval city of Paris. They ruthlessly bulldozed the narrow, winding, labyrinthine streets where the working class had historically built their revolutionary barricades.
And they replaced them with those iconic, massive, wide boulevards we associate with Paris today.
They are beautiful, yes.
Yeah.
But their width was a deliberate military calculation. You cannot block a 30-meter-wide boulevard with overturned carts and paving stones. And more importantly, you can march massive regiments of state troops down them, and you have clear lines of sight to fire artillery directly into a crowd.
Is urban planning as a weapon of counterinsurgency?
Precisely. But there was a massive carrot attached to that stick. While Haussmann was tearing up the streets, he also built modern sewer systems. He built aqueducts to bring in fresh drinking water. He installed gas lighting to make the streets safe at night. The implicit message from the state was, we have the power to crush you, but if you behave, we will make sure you don't die of typhus.
We see a very similar public health awakening in Britain with Edwin Chadwick.
Chadwick was a sanitation reformer. He used hard statistical data to prove to the British Parliament that filth and lack of sanitation were directly causing disease and death, which in turn cost the state money in lost labor and poor relief. This leads directly to the Public Health Act of 1848. The government starts sending inspectors into slums. They mandate building codes. It's the birth of the modern administrative state.
But perhaps the most powerful, long-lasting tool the interventionist state deployed was public education.
By the late 19th century, governments across Europe are making elementary education free and compulsory. Children from ages 6 to 12 had to go to school.
Why the sudden interest in educating the masses? The elites used to think that teaching the poor to read would just encourage them to rebel.
3 very practical reasons. First, after they finally started passing effective child labor laws, there were suddenly millions of working-class kids roaming the streets. School was a way to warehouse and discipline them. Second, the Second Industrial Revolution was highly technical. You can't have an illiterate peasant operating complex chemical machinery or managing a railway schedule. The economy demanded a literate workforce.
And the third reason?
Mass nationalism. State indoctrination. If the government controls the curriculum, they control the minds of the next generation. You force everyone to learn the standardized national language, effectively wiping out local dialects. You teach them a heavily sanitized, glorified version of national history. You teach them to revere the flag and the monarch.
You are manufacturing loyal citizens.
And more importantly, willing future soldiers.
But the people weren't just passively accepting all this state control. They were organizing themselves. This is the era of mass politics.
The working class finally figured out how to leverage their numbers. Labor unions, which had been illegal for most of the century, were finally legalized. They learned to use the strike as a massive economic weapon to force owners to improve wages and safety.
And they formed actual political parties.
This is huge. But look at the SPD in Germany, the Social Democratic Party. By 1912, they were the largest single political party in the German Reichstag. They were fundamentally a Marxist party, but they had decided to work within the democratic system rather than staging a violent revolt. This terrified the conservative German elites.
And we cannot leave this topic without talking about the political awakening of half the population, feminism and the suffrage movement.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, women began aggressively demanding the right to vote. In Britain, you had the WSPU, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters. They realized that polite petitioning was getting them nowhere.
So they adopted militant tactics.
Very militant. They chained themselves to railings, they smashed department store windows, they burned down unoccupied buildings. When they were arrested, they went on hunger strikes in prison, which forced the government to brutally force-feed them. Their argument was simple and devastating. In a modern, industrialized democracy, you cannot demand that women pay taxes and abide by the laws while completely excluding them from citizenship.
Okay, we need to take a breath and pull all of these massive threads together. Let's look at the grand synthesis. We've traced the timeline from 1815, a quiet agrarian world ruled by divine right monarchs, to 1914.
A world defined by mass steel production, electricity, sprawling urban cities, mass political parties, and incredibly fierce state-sponsored nationalism.
When you lay it all out like this, the idea that the 19th century was an era of long peace seems almost laughable. It feels more like a giant pressure cooker that was just building up steam for 100 years.
That is exactly how you should conceptualize it. The industrialization we just mapped out provided both the means and the motivation for World War I.
Let's break that down. The means.
Without the Second Industrial Revolution, World War I is physically impossible. You need massive steel factories to churn out millions of artillery shells. You need a complex, integrated railway network to mobilize millions of soldiers and rush them to the border in a matter of days. You need the telegraph to coordinate massive armies across hundreds of miles of trenches.
And the motivation. Why did they actually pull the trigger?
Because industrial capitalism inherently demands continuous growth. By the late 19th century, powers like Germany and Britain were fiercely competing on a global scale for raw materials and captive markets to absorb their manufactured goods. This imperial friction created rigid, paranoid alliance systems.
And the nationalism we talked about.
Those public schools did their jobs perfectly. They produced an entire generation of young men who were intensely, fiercely loyal to their state and who were absolutely convinced that their national neighbors were their existential enemies.
There's also a darker theory about class conflict playing a role in starting the war, isn't there?
Yes, the primates, they're in politic theory. Some historians argue that the conservative elites in places like Germany and Austria actually welcomed the idea of a war in 1914. They looked at the massive rise of the socialist parties, they looked at the labor strikes, and they thought, we are losing control of our own country.
So they thought a war would fix it.
They thought a short, glorious, patriotic war would unify the country. It would make the workers forget about socialism and rally around the Kaiser. They thought it would save the traditional monarchy.
That has to be one of the most tragic miscalculations in human history.
It was the ultimate miscalculation, because they thought they were going to fight a traditional 19th century war with cavalry and honor. They did not comprehend that industrialization had completely changed the mathematics of violence.
They didn't realize they were feeding a generation of men into a mechanized meat grinder.
The machine gun, the heavy siege artillery, the poison gas synthesized in chemical labs. These are the exact same products of the Second Industrial Revolution as the streetcar or the electric light bulb. Industrialization gave humanity the tools to build a modern paradise and the exact same tools to completely destroy it.
That is an incredibly heavy realization. 1914 wasn't a sudden break from the progress of the 19th century. It was the harvest.
Perfectly said. The much celebrated progress of the long 19th century led in a straight, unbroken line directly into the mud of the Somme.
So to leave you with a final thought, the next time you look at a towering steel skyscraper, or you ride an underground subway, or you look at a labor union contract, I want you to see the ghosts of the 19th century. They built the modern foundations of the world we live in today, but they also built the precise weapons that very nearly burned that world to the ground.
It is the ultimate double-edged sword of human ingenuity.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the past.